My son-in-law shouted, "Get out of this house!" I stayed silent and decided to leave, then bought a house for $3. They thought I wouldn't survive, but I was about to prove my own worth. And then they would all pay the price. Welcome, everyone. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. I'd love to know. And subscribe if you want to see how this ends. Quick note, names and details have been changed, but the message is real. Now let's go back to that night. I stood in the hallway of the house I'd lived in for 2 years, the house my daughter Barbara shared with her husband Vincent, the house that had never quite felt like home, but had been the only shelter I had since Harold died. It was early October in Madison, and the evenings had started to bite. Inside, the air was warm but heavy. The television murmured from the living room, some game show I'd stopped paying attention to weeks ago. The smell of reheated casserole hung in the air, faint and tired. Barbara sat on the edge of the couch, hands folded in her lap, staring at the carpet. Vincent stood by the window with his back to me, arms crossed. He didn't turn around when he spoke. "You can't stay here anymore." I'd known it was coming. I'd felt it in the silences at dinner, in the way Barbara stopped meeting my eyes, in the way Vincent's voice had grown colder every time I asked a question or made a sound. But knowing didn't make it easier to hear. "Vincent," I said quietly, "please, I won't be any trouble. I can sleep in the basement. I'll stay out of the way. This isn't up for discussion." He still didn't look at me, just checked his watch like I was wasting his time. I turned to Barbara. "Barbara, please." She squeezed her eyes shut. A tear slid down her cheek, but she didn't say a word. She didn't stand. She didn't move. Vincent finally turned. His face was blank, businesslike. "You have 10 minutes. I went to the small room off the kitchen, the one they'd let me use when I first moved in. It had been a guest room once. Now it was just a place to keep things they didn't want to see. I pulled the duffel bag out from under the bed. My hands were shaking, but I made myself move. 3 cotton shirts, 1 pair of jeans, a sweater with a hole in the sleeve, underwear, a toothbrush, a hairbrush, my wallet. Inside the wallet, 3 $1 bills. I reached for the photo on the nightstand, Harold in his reading glasses smiling at something I'd said. I tucked it carefully into the front pocket of the bag. I didn't let myself look at it again. When I came back down, Vincent was holding the front door open. Barbara was gone. I heard a door close softly upstairs. I stepped out onto the porch. The October wind cut through my sweater, sharp and clean. I turned back just once, hoping maybe Barbara would come down. Hoping maybe the door would stay open. Vincent closed it. The lock clicked. The porch light went out. I stood there on the sidewalk with my duffel bag and my breath fogging in the cold. I looked down at my hands. The veins raised the skin, thin and loose. 70 years old. 70 years of working, raising a child, burying a husband, surviving. And it had come to this. $3, 1 bag, and a daughter who couldn't look me in the eye. I adjusted the strap on my shoulder. The street was dark and empty. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't have a plan. But I couldn't stand there forever, so I walked. At 70 years old, with $3 and nowhere to go, I walked into the October night. I walked until my feet ached, until the houses thinned out and the streetlights grew farther apart. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stop. Eventually, I found a park. Just a small one with a few benches and a rusted swing set that creaked in the wind. I sat down on the nearest bench, pulled my duffel onto my lap, and wrapped my arms around it like it might keep me warm. It didn't. The cold worked its way through my sweater, through my jeans, through my skin. My fingers went numb first, then my toes. I tucked my hands under my arms and pulled my knees up as close as I could, but it didn't help much. The wind kept coming sharp and relentless, like it was looking for a way in. I thought about Harold, about the way he used to bundle me up before we'd go out to check the traps in the winter. "Layer up, Ruthie," he'd say, "and keep moving. Your body makes its own heat if you let it." So I stood. I paced along the edge of the park, back and forth, back and forth. My knees protested. My back ached. But I kept moving because the alternative was sitting still, and sitting still meant freezing. I don't know how many hours passed. The night stretched on, forever dark and empty. I watched the sky slowly fade from black to deep blue, and finally to the pale gray of dawn. By the time the sun came up, I was so tired I could barely stand. But I was still breathing, still alive. That had to count for something. I left the park when the first joggers started to appear. I didn't want anyone to see me. Didn't want anyone to ask questions. So I walked back toward the center of town, past the coffee shops that were just opening, past the bakery, where the smell of fresh bread made my stomach twist with hunger. I stopped on a corner and opened my wallet. 3 $1 bills. I counted them twice just to be sure. $3, I whispered. What can you even buy with $3? Not much. Not enough. I kept walking. That's when I saw it. The courthouse. A tall brick building with wide stone steps and a bulletin board out front covered in notices and announcements. I don't know what made me stop. Maybe I was just looking for a place to rest. Maybe I was looking for something else. I climbed the steps slowly one at a time and stood in front of the board. Most of the notices were about permits and ordinances and public meetings, but there was one pinned near the bottom that caught my eye. Property auction. County foreclosure abandoned residence near Pierre, South Dakota. Minimum bid $3 auction date. October 12th, 10 a.m. I read it twice. Then a third time. $3. I had $3. My heart beat faster. My hands started to shake, and this time it wasn't from the cold. A house. For $3. It didn't make sense. Houses didn't cost $3. There had to be something wrong with it. Something broken, something dangerous, something that made it worthless to everyone else. But it wasn't worthless to me, because I had nowhere to go. No family that wanted me, no savings, no plan, just $3, and a house that needed exactly that. I stood there on the courthouse steps with the wind pulling at my hair and the morning light creeping across the stone. I didn't know if this was fate or just cruel timing. I didn't know if I was being given a chance or walking into another kind of trap. But I knew one thing. I had $3. The house needed $3. And maybe, just maybe, that meant something. The auction started at 4 o'clock. I'd spent the day walking the streets trying to stay warm watching the clock. When it was time, I went back. The auction room smelled like dust and old paper. The kind of smell that settles into a building when nothing ever changes, when the same people sit in the same chairs, year after year, watching the same properties cycle through foreclosure and sale. I sat in the back row. There were maybe a dozen other people scattered around the room, most of them men in work boots and flannel flipping through auction catalogs. A few glanced at me when I walked in, but no one said anything. At the front of the room, a woman sat behind a long table stacked with files. She looked to be in her 50s with short gray hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. Her nameplate read Phyllis Crane County Clerk. She cleared her throat and began reading from a list, her voice flat and practiced. Lot 14, residential property foreclosed 2016. Located approximately 4 miles outside Pierre, South Dakota. Structure abandoned, no utilities, sold as is. Minimum bid $3. She looked up, scanning the room over the top of her glasses. Do I have a bid? Silence. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. My hand was shaking so badly I had to steady it with the other one, but I lifted it anyway. $3. Every head in the room turned. Phyllis looked at me for a long moment. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Not pity exactly, maybe recognition, maybe respect. $3, she repeated. Do I have any other bids? More silence. A man in the second row whispered something to his neighbor. I caught the words, poor thing, and shame. Phyllis waited the full 30 seconds, her pen poised over the ledger. Hearing no further bids sold to the woman in the back for $3. She gestured me forward. I stood on legs that felt like they might give out and walked to the front of the room. Phyllis slid a form across the table and handed me a pen. Sign here and here. I signed. My handwriting looked shaky and old. Phyllis stamped the form, then pulled a certificate from a drawer and filled it out by hand. She slid it across the table to me, along with a carbon copy. That'll be $2 for the processing fee. My stomach dropped. I opened my wallet, took out 2 of my 3 remaining dollars, and set them on the table. Phyllis took them without comment and tucked them into a cash box. I stood there, holding the certificate, staring at the embossed county seal and the words, Ruth Brennan, owner. $1 left. $1 and a house I'd never seen. Phyllis looked at me over her glasses again. This time her voice was a little softer. "Good luck, Mrs. Brennan." I nodded. I didn't trust myself to speak. I folded the certificate carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of my coat, right next to the photo of Harold. Then I walked out of that courthouse into the late afternoon air. The sky had turned gray. The wind had picked up colder than it had been that morning. I could smell it in the air, the kind of cold that meant snow wasn't far behind. Winter was coming early this year. The sun was already low when I started walking south out of Pierre. The house sat alone in the middle of the prairie like a broken tooth. I saw it from a quarter mile away, a dark shape against the flat gray sky. My feet had been aching for the last 2 miles, maybe longer. I'd had to stop 3 times just to catch my breath, leaning against fence posts and trying not to think about how far I still had to go. 4 miles outside Pierre. That's what the auction notice had said. 4 miles didn't sound like much when you were sitting in a courthouse. But when you were 70 years old with a duffel bag on your shoulder and $1 in your pocket, 4 miles felt like crossing a continent. Still, I kept walking, because there was nowhere else to go. As I got closer, the shape of the house came into focus, and with every step, my heart sank a little further. It wasn't just old, it was dying. The roof had caved in on the right side, leaving a gaping hole where shingles and beams had collapsed into the attic. The windows were just empty frames now, the glass long gone, leaving dark, hollow eyes staring out at nothing. The front door hung crooked on a single bent hinge, swaying slightly in the wind, like it was too tired to hold itself up anymore. The siding was weathered gray, split, and warped in places where the wood had rotted through. I could see gaps between the board's cracks, wide enough to let the wind blow straight through. I stopped at the edge of the overgrown yard and just stood there staring. This was it. This was what $3 bought. I wanted to cry. I wanted to sit down in the dirt and just give up. But I didn't. Instead, I walked up to the sagging porch, tested the first step with my foot, and climbed carefully onto the boards. They creaked under my weight, but held. The door didn't have a lock. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was cold and damp, heavy with the smell of mildew and rot. The floor was littered with dead leaves and dirt that had blown in through the broken windows. In the corner, I could see daylight coming through a gap in the wall where 2 boards had pulled apart. There was no furniture, no curtains, no sign that anyone had lived here in years. I walked through the front room into what must have once been a kitchen. The sink was rusted through. The cupboards hung open empty, except for a few mouse droppings. The back door was missing entirely, just an open rectangle looking out onto more prairie. I went back to the front room and set my duffel down on the floor. Then I stood in the center of the space, my arms wrapped around myself, and looked up at the ceiling. Through the hole in the roof, I could see the gray sky turning darker. This was mine. It was broken. It was cold. It was falling apart. But it was mine. No one could take it from me. No one could tell me I wasn't wanted here. No one could lock the door behind me and turn out the lights. I sat down on the floor, leaned back against the wall, and pulled my sweater tighter around my shoulders. My whole body ached. My stomach was empty. My hands were still shaking. But I was inside, under a roof, in a place that belonged to me. That night, I slept in a house that had been abandoned for a reason. But I was too tired to wonder why. Night came fast on the prairie. The last sliver of daylight disappeared through the hole in the roof, and the cold moved in like something alive. It crept through the cracks in the walls, slid under the broken door, seeped up through the floorboards. Within an hour, I couldn't feel my fingers. I sat in the corner, farthest from the door, my duffel bag wedged behind me like a pillow. I'd put on every piece of clothing I owned, 3 shirts layered one on top of the other, my jeans, my torn sweater, and I'd wrapped my spare pair of underwear around my hands like makeshift gloves. It didn't help much. My teeth chattered so hard I thought they might crack. The house was full of sounds. The wind howled through the empty window frames, rattling what was left of the door. Something skittered across the floor in the dark mice, probably, or rats. Outside, a tree branch scraped against the siding over and over, a slow, rhythmic scratching that made my skin crawl. I pulled my knees up to my chest and tried to make myself as small as possible. I thought about Barbara. I'd raised her by myself after Harold died. She'd been 12, then angry and confused and scared. I'd worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on, to put food on the table, to make sure she had what she needed. I'd sat with her through homework and heartbreak and every hard thing that came her way. And she couldn't even look at me when her husband threw me out. Why? I whispered into the dark. Why did you let him do that? No answer, just the wind and the scratching and the cold. I closed my eyes and tried to remember her when she was little. The way she used to climb into my lap and fall asleep with her head on my shoulder. The way she'd hold my hand crossing the street. The way she used to tell me she loved me every single night before bed. That girl was gone now. Or maybe she'd never really existed. Maybe I'd just been fooling myself all along. I pressed my hands against my face and felt the sting of tears. But I didn't let myself cry. Not yet. "You can do this, Ruth," I said out loud. My voice sounded small and strange in the empty room. "You've done harder things than this." I'd buried a husband at 42 and kept going. I'd raised a child alone and kept going. I'd survived 68 winters before this one. I could survive one more night. I pulled Harold's photo out of my coat pocket and held it close to my chest, even though I couldn't see his face in the dark. I imagined him sitting next to me the way he used to when things got hard. "Layer up, Ruthie," he'd say, "and keep moving." But I was too cold to move, too tired, so I just sat there shivering, waiting. The hours dragged on, the cold got worse. My body ached from sitting on the hard floor. At some point, I must have dozed off because I jerked awake to the sound of something crashing outside, maybe a branch falling, maybe something else. I opened my eyes and saw the faintest trace of gray light creeping through the broken windows. Morning. It came slow, grudging, like it didn't want to bother. But it came, and I was still breathing. Hunger made decisions simple. I had $1. I needed food, so I walked. 4 miles back to Millbrook. My legs were stiff from the cold floor, my knees protesting with every step. But I kept moving because sitting still meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering the look on Barbara's face when Vincent closed the door. The town was small, just a handful of blocks clustered around a main street, a hardware store, a post office, a diner with a faded sign that read, Millie's. I stood outside the diner for a long time staring at the menu taped to the window. Eggs and toast, $4.50. Coffee and a muffin, $3.25. Oatmeal, $2.75. I had $1. Not enough for anything. I turned away before anyone inside could see me staring. Across the street, a small shop caught my eye. The sign above the door read Porter's Fabric and Notions in faded gold letters. Through the window, I could see bolts of cloth stacked on shelves, and more importantly, I could see warmth, light. A place to sit for a few minutes without anyone asking questions. I pushed the door open. A bell chimed softly overhead. The shop smelled like cotton and old wood. It was warm, blessedly, wonderfully warm. I stood just inside the door, letting the heat sink into my bones. "Can I help you?" I looked up. A woman stood behind the counter, maybe 65 or 70, with short silver hair and sharp blue eyes. She wore a cardigan over a flowered blouse, and she was looking at me with the kind of expression people use when they're trying to decide whether to be kind or call the police. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. I needed to warm up for a minute. I'll go." "You're the one who bought the Harper place." It wasn't a question. I nodded slowly. "Yesterday." She studied me for a long moment. I could see her taking in the worn sweater, the duffel bag, the way my hands were shaking, even though the shop was warm. "For $3, she said. "Yes, ma'am." Another silence. Then she turned and walked to the back of the shop. I thought maybe she was going to tell me to leave, but instead she returned with a bundle in her arms, a roll of heavy canvas fabric, and a coil of thick rope. She set them on the counter. "You're going to need these," she said. I stared at the bundle. "I don't have any money." "I didn't ask for any." I looked up at her confused. She met my eyes, and for the first time, her expression softened just a little. "The Harper place has been empty for 8 years. The roof's got a hole in it the size of a truck. You can't survive a South Dakota winter in that house without covering that hole. My throat tightened. I didn't know what to say. She pushed the bundle across the counter toward me. Take it, and come back if you need anything else. I picked up the canvas and the rope. They were heavier than I expected. My arms shook under the weight, but I held on. Thank you, I whispered. She nodded once. What's your name? Ruth Brennan. Gladys Porter. She gestured toward the door. Go on now, you've got work to do. I walked out of that shop with the canvas tucked under my arm and the rope looped over my shoulder. The weight of it pressed into my side with every step, but I didn't mind. It wasn't the fabric or the rope that felt heavy. It was the meaning of it. Someone had seen me. Someone had helped me. I wasn't completely alone. I'd never rebuilt a house, but I'd sewn torn dresses, patched holes in socks, fixed broken chairs. I knew how to look at something broken and figure out where to start. I stood in the middle of the front room and asked myself the only question that mattered. What's dangerous? What can wait? The hole in the roof? Dangerous. The broken windows? Dangerous. The gaps in the walls? Dangerous. Everything else could wait. I started with the debris. Dead leaves, dirt chunks of rotted wood scattered across the floor. I swept it all into piles with my hands, carried it outside armload by armload. My back ached. My knees protested. But I kept moving. By midday, the floor was clear. I looked up at the collapsed section of roof. Beams and boards lay in a tangled heap where they'd fallen through. Some of the wood was still solid weathered, but not rotted. I could use that. I salvaged boards from the collapsed roof wood that had already fallen easier to move than trying to pry anything else loose. I dragged the smaller pieces out first one at a time, then the longer beams. I used a piece of scrap wood as a lever, wedging it under the heavy timbers and pushing down. It worked. Slowly, painfully, but it worked. By late afternoon, I had a small pile of salvaged wood stacked outside. I took the canvas Gladys had given me and climbed carefully onto the least damaged section of the roof. My hands shook as I spread the heavy fabric over the hole, weighing down the edges with loose bricks and chunks of broken concrete I'd found in the yard. It wasn't perfect. The wind would probably tear it loose eventually, but it was something. Back inside, I turned my attention to the walls. The gaps between the boards let the wind blow straight through. I tore strips from the leftover canvas, just small pieces, and stuffed them into the worst cracks. I didn't have nails yet, so I wedged the fabric in tight with slivers of wood. My fingers were stiff and sore. The arthritis in my knuckles flared with every movement, but I kept working. 2 hours on, 1 hour off. That was the rhythm I found. Work until my body screamed. Rest until I could stand again. Then work some more. I rationed my energy the way I'd ration the $3. Carefully, deliberately, nothing wasted. By the time the sun started to set, one corner of the room looked different. The wind didn't howl through it anymore. The floor was clean. The worst of the cold was blocked. I sat down in that corner, my back against the wall, and unwrapped the last piece of day-old bread I'd bought 3 days ago. It was hard and stale, but I chewed it slowly, making it last. Outside, the prairie stretched flat and empty in every direction. The sky was turning pink and orange, the kind of sunset Harold used to love. I thought about Barbara, about the warm house in Madison, about the casserole smell and the television murmur and the locked door. Then I looked around at the broken walls, the patched cracks, the canvas flapping gently overhead. It wasn't much. The house was still broken, still cold, still barely standing. But it was mine, and that was enough. A week passed, then another. The Simmons farm sat a mile down the road, neat and solid against the flat prairie horizon. I didn't know anyone lived that close until the morning I heard the truck. I was outside struggling with a piece of rotted timber I'd pried off the side of the house. It was longer than I was tall and twice as heavy as it looked. I'd been trying to drag it away from the foundation for 20 minutes, my back screaming, my hands blistered. The truck slowed, then stopped. An older man climbed out, maybe 70, with white hair under a faded cap and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of outdoor work. A woman sat in the passenger seat watching through the windshield. "You need a hand," he called. I straightened up, wiping my forehead. I can manage. He walked closer, hands in his pockets, studying the beam and the way I'd wedged a smaller piece of wood underneath it like a lever. "You're using a fulcrum," he said. "That's smart." I didn't know what a fulcrum was, but I nodded anyway. He crouched down beside the beam. "Problem is your pivot point's too far out. Move it here." He tapped a spot closer to the center, "and you'll get better lift, less strain on your back." I looked at him, then at the beam. "Like this? Yeah, now try." I repositioned the smaller piece of wood and pushed down on the lever. The beam lifted easily, smooth as anything. I stared at it, then at him. "How did you know that?" "Been fixing things my whole life." He stood and brushed the dirt off his hands. "Harold Simmons, that's my wife Lorraine." The woman had climbed out of the truck now. She was shorter than him, with gray hair pulled back in a bun and kind eyes. She carried a silver thermos in one hand. "You look like you could use this," she said, holding it out. I took it. The warmth of it seeped into my palms. "Thank you." "Coffee," Lorraine said. "Nothing fancy, but it's hot." I unscrewed the cap and took a sip. It was strong and bitter, and the best thing I'd tasted in 2 weeks. Harold glanced at the house, then back at me. "You're the one who bought the Harper place." "I am." He nodded slowly like he was working something out in his head. "That roof's going to be your biggest problem. You get snow on that hole, the whole structure could come down." "I know." "You got tools." I shook my head. He walked back to the truck and returned with a wooden toolbox. He set it down at my feet and opened it. Inside were a hammer, a box of nails, a handsaw, a measuring tape. "Use these," he said. "Bring them back when you're done." I stared at the tools. "I don't know how to—" "You'll learn," he met my eyes. "Nobody's born knowing how to fix a house, Mrs. Brennan, Ruth Brennan. Mrs. Brennan, you'll figure it out. And if you don't come find me, farm's just down the road." Lorraine poured the rest of the coffee into the thermos cap and handed it to me. "Don't be a stranger," she said gently. They climbed back into the truck. As they pulled away, I heard Harold say to Lorraine, "The old Harper place. Word travels fast in a town like this." I stood there holding the toolbox, the weight of it settling into my arms. It was heavier than the canvas Gladys had given me, heavier than it should have been, because it wasn't just tools. It was trust. This town I thought might let me stay. November came with snow. I woke to the sound of silence, the kind that only comes when the world is buried under something soft and heavy. I opened my eyes and saw white dust scattered across the floor where it had blown in through the cracks overhead. The canvas I'd stretched across the roof had held, mostly. But the edges had come loose in the wind, and now snow was finding its way in thin and persistent, like the cold had learned to move in new ways. I sat up, my breath fogging in the air, and wrapped my arms around myself. Winter wasn't going to wait. I pulled on my sweater, still damp from the day before, and stepped outside. The prairie was white as far as I could see, the sky low and gray. The temperature had dropped overnight. I could feel it in my joints, in the stiffness of my fingers, in the way my lungs burned with every breath. I couldn't afford to wait anymore. I'd found a few scraps of plastic sheeting in a trash pile behind the post office 2 days earlier, torn and dirty, but still intact. I'd folded them carefully and brought them back. Now I dragged them out and climbed the wooden ladder I'd propped against the side of the house. My knees protested with every step. The arthritis flared hot and sharp, but I gritted my teeth and kept climbing. At the top, I leaned out over the edge of the roof and pulled the loose corner of the canvas back into place. The wet snow clung to my coat, soaking through the fabric. This cold was different from before. It wasn't just sharp and biting, it was damp. It clung to you. It seeped in and wouldn't let go. I layered the plastic sheeting over the canvas, weighing it down with more bricks. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped one. It slipped from my grip and tumbled off the edge, hitting the ground below with a dull thud. I froze, my heart pounding. One wrong move, and that could be me. I climbed down, slowly testing each rung before putting my weight on it. When I reached the ground, my legs were trembling. I sat down hard in the snow, my back against the house, and tried to catch my breath. The snow kept falling, soft, steady, relentless. I looked out at the white prairie, at the gray sky, at the house that was barely holding together. "I might not make it through this," I whispered. The words hung in the cold air, visible for a moment before they disappeared. I thought about Barbara, about the warm house in Madison, about what it would feel like to just stop, to lie down in the snow and let the cold take over. It would be easy. But easy wasn't a choice I had. I'd spent 70 years doing hard things, burying a husband, raising a child alone, surviving when survival didn't seem possible. I wasn't going to stop now. I pushed myself up off the ground, my knees screaming in protest. I picked up the ladder and leaned it back against the house. Then I climbed, one rung at a time. Morris Becker didn't trust people easily. That's what Gladys told me when she mentioned his name. "He's a good man," she'd said, "but he's been burned before. He'll test you." I didn't expect him to show up at my door 2 days later. He drove up in a dusty pickup parked in the yard and sat there for a long moment just watching. I was outside trying to reinforce the porch steps with scraps of wood. My hands were raw, my knuckles swollen, but I kept working. Finally, he climbed out. "You're the woman who bought this place," he said, not a question. "I am." He looked at the house, then at me. His face was weathered and hard, the kind of face that didn't give anything away. "I need a barn door fixed," he said. "You know how to do that." I hesitated. I'd watched Harold fix a dozen doors over the years. I'd held the wood while he measured, handed him nails learned by watching. But I'd never done it alone. "I can try," I said. His expression didn't change. "I don't pay people to try." Worrying I met his eyes. "Then I'll do it." He studied me for another long moment. Then he nodded. "Get in the truck." His farm was 3 miles east, a neat spread with a white house and a red barn. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges, the wood split down the middle. Morris handed me a toolbox. "Everything you need's in there." Then he walked away. I stood there alone, staring at the door. My heart was pounding. I couldn't afford to mess this up. I took a breath and got to work. First I measured. Harold's voice in my head, "Measure, twice cut once." I marked the wood carefully, then used the handsaw to cut a replacement board from the pile Morris had left. My hands ached. The saw blade caught and jumped, but I steadied it and kept going. It took me an hour just to cut the board. Then I had to remove the damaged section. The nails were rusted and stubborn. I used the claw hammer to pry them loose one by one, my fingers screaming with every pull. By the time I had the new board in place, my shoulders were on fire. I lined it up, checked it twice, then hammered in the nails. Steady, even. The way Harold used to do it. 4 hours later, I stepped back. The door hung straight. The hinges moved smoothly. It opened and closed without sticking. I heard footsteps behind me. Morris walked up, tested the door himself, pushed it open, and closed it 3 times. He ran his hand along the new board, checking the alignment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a $20 bill. He held it out. I stared at it. "You did good work," he said. I took the bill with shaking hands. It felt thin and fragile, like it might blow away if I wasn't careful. $20. It wasn't much, but it was proof. Proof that I could do this. Proof that I had value. Proof that maybe, just maybe, I could survive this. "Thank you," I whispered. Morris nodded once. "You need more work, you come find me." Then he turned and walked back toward the house. I stood there in the barn holding that $20 bill like it was made of glass. It wasn't much, but it was enough. December turned brutal. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero. The kind of cold that didn't just bite, it attacked. It was a physical thing, relentless and mean, pressing against the walls, seeping through every crack, stealing the warmth from your body even when you were layered in every piece of clothing you owned. I woke before dawn every morning to clear snow off the roof. If I let it pile up, the weight could bring the whole structure down. So I climbed the ladder in the dark, my breath freezing in the air, and shoveled until my arms gave out. The arthritis in my wrists flared with every movement. Each time I gripped the shovel, pain shot up through my hands like fire. But I couldn't stop. Stopping meant dying. Food was running low. I'd spent 10 of the $20 Morris gave me on supplies, a bag of dried beans, a loaf of bread, a can of soup. I rationed it carefully. Watery soup in the morning, a slice of bread at night. My stomach cramped with hunger, but I made it last. The house was never warm. The canvas and plastic I'd patched over the roof kept most of the snow out, but the cold came through anyway. At night, I huddled in the corner with every piece of fabric I owned wrapped around me, shivering until my body finally gave in to exhaustion. Some mornings I woke up and couldn't feel my feet. I'd rub them, press them against the floor, try to work the blood back into them. It took longer every time. One afternoon, I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find Gladys standing on the porch, a wool blanket folded in her arms. She'd been stopping by every few days since the snow started, always with something: a thermos of soup, a pair of old gloves, a bundle of firewood she said she didn't need anymore. We both knew she was lying, but I never said it out loud. "You're stubborn," she said, holding out the blanket. I took it, my hands shaking. The weight of it felt like mercy. "I don't have a choice," I said. "We all have choices." Her voice was firm but kind. "You chose to fight." I looked down at the blanket. It was thick and heavy, woven in shades of blue and gray, the kind of thing that might actually keep me warm through the night. "I don't know if I'm fighting or just surviving," I said quietly. "Same thing," Gladys said. She reached out and squeezed my hand. Her skin was warm. I'd forgotten what warm felt like. "Come into town if it gets too bad," she said. "My door's always open." I nodded, but we both knew I wouldn't. I couldn't afford to leave the house unguarded. If the roof collapsed while I was gone, I'd have nothing left. Gladys seemed to understand that. She didn't push. She just turned and walked back to her truck, the snow crunching under her boots. I stood in the doorway watching her drive away, the blanket clutched against my chest. That night, wrapped in Gladys's blanket, I thought about what she'd said. You chose to fight. Had I, or had fighting just been the only option left, I thought about Barbara, about Vincent, about the locked door and the cold night and the $3 in my wallet. I hadn't chosen any of that, but I'd chosen to keep walking. I'd chosen to climb the courthouse steps. I'd chosen to raise my hand at the auction, and every morning I chose to wake up. Maybe that was enough. The wind howled outside, rattling the walls. The cold pressed in, relentless as ever. But I was still here, still breathing. And as long as I kept waking up, I'd keep going. Clifford, the mailman, rarely drove this far out. That's why I was surprised when I heard the postal truck rattling up the road one afternoon in mid-December. I'd been outside patching cracks in the foundation with mud and straw, my hands stiff from the cold. Clifford pulled up and rolled down his window. He was maybe 55 with a gray mustache and a weathered face. "Heard you were out here," he said. "I am." He looked at the house, then back at me. "People in town said you wouldn't last a month." "I'm still here." He smiled a little. Surprised, maybe even impressed. "So you are." He reached over and pulled out 2 envelopes from his stack. "Got a couple letters forwarded from Madison, Wisconsin. Sent to your old address first, then rerouted here. Looks like somebody set up mail forwarding for you." I froze. "Forwarding service." "Yeah, says it was requested early November." He checked the routing labels. "Forwarding address is this property, the Harper Place. Standard procedure once it's in place." I stared at the envelopes in his hand. "I didn't request any forwarding," I said quietly. Clifford frowned. "Well, somebody did. Had to be someone who knew you were here." My throat tightened. "When were these originally sent?" I asked. Clifford checked the postmarks. Bank letters dated November 18th. Insurance one came a few days after. November 18th. Just 3 weeks after Vincent had thrown me out. He held them out. I took them slowly, my hands shaking. The first envelope was from First National Bank of Madison. The second from Midwest Life Insurance Company. "Everything okay, Mrs. Brennan?" I didn't know how to answer. "I'm not sure," I said. He nodded slowly. "Well, if you need anything, post office is open till 4. Phone's there, too, if you need to call someone." "Thank you." He tipped his hat and drove off. I stood there in the snow, holding the 2 envelopes. The bank, the insurance company. Why would they be writing to me? I walked back inside and sat down in the corner where I slept. I set the envelopes in front of me on the dirt floor. The auction had been public. Anyone could have looked up the records. And people talk, especially in small towns. A 70-year-old woman buying a condemned house for $3, that was the kind of story that spread. If someone in Madison had heard about it, if Barbara had heard, she would have known exactly where I was. And if she knew, she'd want to make sure nothing tied her to me anymore. No mail coming back to the house in Madison. No questions. No paper trail. So she'd forwarded it all here. To me. To this broken house in the middle of nowhere. Not out of kindness, out of fear. She wanted to cut me off completely. I stared at the envelopes. The paper was crisp and white and official looking. I should open them. I needed to know. But I didn't move. Because once I opened them, I couldn't unknow whatever was inside. And right now, I was still just a woman surviving in a broken house, still fighting, still breathing. Whatever was in these letters could take that away, so I set them down, carefully, not forever, just for now. I'd open them when I was ready, but not yet. I opened the first envelope after the sun went down. I'd been sitting near the makeshift stove I'd built from an old metal drum, feeding it scraps of wood to keep the small fire going. The heat barely reached beyond a few feet, but it was enough to take the edge off the cold. I held the envelope from the bank in my hands for a long time before I finally tore it open. The letter inside was short, professional, typed on official letterhead. Dear Estate of Ruth Brennan, we are deeply sorry for your loss. According to the death certificate filed on November 15, 2024, your account has been closed per standard procedure. The remaining balance of $12,847 has been transferred to the listed beneficiary Barbara Drummond, as per your account instructions. Please contact us if you have any questions. Sincerely, First National Bank of Madison. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time. The words didn't change. Death certificate. November 15th. Barbara Drummond. My hands started to shake. I set the letter down and picked up the second envelope. My fingers fumbled with the seal. It took me 3 tries to tear it open. This one was from the insurance company. Dear Ms. Drummond, we are writing to confirm that your life insurance claim has been approved. The policy held by Ruth Brennan in the amount of $50,000 has been paid in full to you as the sole beneficiary. Our condolences on your loss. I let the letter fall from my hands. $50,000. $12,000 more from the bank. I sat there staring at the papers scattered on the floor in front of me and felt the world tilt sideways. They'd declared me dead. Barbara and Vincent had filed a death certificate. They'd closed my bank account. They'd collected my life insurance. And I was sitting here 400 miles away, freezing in a broken house, still very much alive. Vincent must have rushed the paperwork. He'd wanted that money badly enough to forge documents to lie to the bank, to the insurance company, to everyone. I pressed my hands against my face. I wasn't just cast out. I wasn't just abandoned. I was erased. On paper, Ruth Brennan didn't exist anymore. I thought about Barbara, about the tears on her face that night, about the way she couldn't look at me. Had she known? Had she helped him do this? Or had Vincent done it alone and she'd just let him? I didn't know which was worse. I sat there for a long time, the fire crackling softly in the drum beside me, the cold pressing in from all sides. They hadn't harmed me with a weapon. They hadn't harmed me with force. They'd harmed me with paperwork and lies, and somehow that felt worse, because it meant they'd planned it. They'd sat down together, maybe at the kitchen table, maybe in the living room where Barbara used to sit and stare at the carpet, and they'd decided that I was worth more dead than alive. $62,000. That's what my life was worth to them. I pulled my knees up to my chest and wrapped my arms around them, staring at the letters on the floor. I was dead, but I was still breathing. For 2 days after I opened those letters, I barely moved. I lay in the corner where I slept, wrapped in Gladys's blanket, staring at the wall. The fire in the metal drum went out. The cold crept back in. I didn't care. I didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't work. I just lay there. I thought about Barbara when she was small. The way she used to curl up in my lap when she was scared, the way I'd sit up all night when she had a fever, pressing cool cloths to her forehead, singing softly until she fell asleep. I remembered the day she graduated high school, the way she'd hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, the way she'd whispered, "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom." I'd given her everything, and she'd taken everything from me. Why would she do this? The question circled in my head over and over, but there was no answer. Or maybe there was, and I just didn't want to see it. $62,000. That was the answer. That was what I was worth to her. On the third day, I heard a knock at the door. I didn't get up. The door creaked open. Footsteps on the floor. Ruth Gladys. She came over and knelt down beside me. I felt her hand on my shoulder, warm even through the layers of clothing. "What happened?" I didn't answer. I just pointed at the letters still lying on the floor where I'd dropped them 3 days ago. Gladys picked them up. I watched her face as she read. Watched the color drain from her cheeks, watched her mouth tighten into a thin line. "Oh, Ruth." She set the letters down carefully and turned back to me. "I don't exist anymore," I said. My voice sounded hoarse, like I'd been screaming. Maybe I had. "According to the law, I'm dead." Gladys squeezed my hand. Her grip was firm and warm. "But you're not dead," she said. "You're right here. You're alive." "On paper, I'm not." "Paper doesn't decide whether you're alive." Her voice was steady, fierce. "Your heart does. Your lungs do. You do." I closed my eyes. Tears leaked out hot against my cold cheeks. "They took everything, Gladys." "I know. My money. My name. My life. I know. And I'm supposed to just, keep going." Gladys was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes." I opened my eyes and looked at her. "You've survived this long," she said. "You've made it through the worst of winter. You've fixed this house with your bare hands. You've proven you can live when everyone said you'd die. That was before I knew. It doesn't matter what you know now." She leaned closer. "Ruth, you're still breathing. That means you still get to choose. You can lie here and let them win, or you can get up." I stared at her. "Get up," she said again, "and fight back." She helped me to my feet. My legs were weak. My body ached from lying still for so long. But I stood. Gladys walked me to the door and pushed it open. "Look," she said. I looked out at the house. At the canvas I'd stretched over the roof, at the walls I'd patched with fabric and wood, at the porch steps I'd reinforced with salvaged boards. It was still broken, still falling apart, but it was standing, because I'd made it stand. Something shifted inside me, something hard and sharp and cold. They'd tried to erase me. They'd declared me dead, taken my money, closed every door. But I was still here. And if I was still here, I wasn't done yet. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Not because I was at peace, but because I had a purpose. The storm hit on Christmas Eve, sudden and vicious. It had been snowing lightly all afternoon, but by evening, the wind picked up howling across the prairie like something wild and angry. The temperature plummeted. The snow came sideways so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the windows. The storm roared outside the walls. The cold invaded every gap, every crack, pressing in from all sides. I fed the fire in the metal drum and wrapped myself in layers, but the heat barely reached beyond the corner where I sat. At 10 o'clock, I heard something, a sound, faint, almost lost in the wind, knocking. I stood and went to the door. When I opened it, the wind nearly knocked me backward. A man stood on the porch holding an elderly woman in his arms. Behind him, a younger woman stood shivering, her face pale with fear. "Please," the man said. His voice was hoarse, desperate. "Our car went off the road a quarter-mile back. My mother-in-law, she can't breathe right. She's—" "Get inside," I said. They stumbled in. I closed the door against the wind and turned to look at them. The man was maybe 50, his coat covered in snow. The younger woman, his wife I guessed, was shaking so badly her teeth chattered. But it was the older woman who worried me most. She was maybe 80 small and frail, her lips tinged blue. Her breathing was shallow and labored, each breath a struggle. "Bring her over here," I said, pointing to the corner near the stove. The man, Roland, he said his name was, carried her over and laid her down gently. His wife, Diane, knelt beside her. "Mom, stay with us," Diane whispered. "Please." I grabbed Gladys's blanket and wrapped it around the old woman, Mabel, they called her. Then I pulled off her wet coat and gloves. "We need to warm her up slowly," I said. "Too fast and it'll shock her system." Harold had taught me that, years ago when he'd pulled a neighbor out of a frozen creek. I positioned Mabel close to the stove, but not too close. I tucked the blanket around her, layering it carefully. Then I went to the corner and grabbed my tin cup scoop snow from just inside the door and held it near the fire until it melted. "Small sips," I told Diane, handing her the cup. "Just a little at a time?" Diane held the cup to her mother's lips. Mabel took a sip, then another. Roland stood nearby, his hands clenched, watching. "Thank you," he said. "We saw the light. We didn't know if anyone lived out here." "I do," I said simply. The hours crawled by. The storm raged outside. Inside, we huddled around the small fire, listening to Mabel's breathing. Slowly, so slowly, the blue tinge faded from her lips. Her breathing deepened. Her eyes fluttered open. "Diane," she whispered. Diane burst into tears and grabbed her mother's hand. "I'm here, Mom. You're okay." Roland sank down onto the floor, his head in his hands. I sat back against the wall and looked at the three of them, this family huddled together in my broken house, alive, because they'd found shelter here. Mabel was 83, 20 years older than me, but not so different. Fragile, vulnerable. One bad night away from the end. But she'd survived, because there was a place for her to go. A light in the dark, a door that opened. I looked around at the patched walls, the canvas roof, the flickering fire and the metal drum. This place wasn't just keeping me alive, it was saving others too. The storm lasted 2 days. We stayed together in that small broken house, huddled around the fire, listening to the wind howl and the walls creak. The temperature outside dropped so low that frost formed on the inside of the windows. But we had warmth, we had shelter, and we had each other. Roland had an emergency kit in the car: crackers, canned soup, bottled water. We pooled what we had and rationed it carefully. It wasn't much, but it was enough. On the second day, when the storm finally started to ease, we sat around the fire and talked. "How long have you been out here?" Diane asked. "Since October," I said. "October." She stared at me. "You've survived out here since October in this house." I nodded. "Why?" Roland asked. Not unkindly, just curious. I hesitated. Then I told them. Not everything. Not about the death certificate or the stolen money, but I told them about Vincent, about being thrown out at 70 years old with $3 and nowhere to go, about buying the house at auction, about learning to survive. When I finished, Diane was crying. "At 70, she whispered, "and you made it through all this." Mabel, who'd been quiet most of the day, reached over and took my hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "We're the same, you and I," she said. Her voice was soft but steady. Stubborn old women who don't know when to quit. I looked at her. This woman who'd come so close to dying 2 nights ago, and I smiled. "I guess we are." She squeezed my hand. "Thank you for not letting me die in the snow. Thank you for giving me a reason to keep the light on." Roland cleared his throat. When I looked at him, his eyes were wet. "We're going to tell people about you," he said, "about this place, about what you've done here." "I don't need fame," I said quickly. "It's not about fame." He leaned forward. "It's about hope. People need to know that hope is real, that someone can lose everything and still survive, still build something." I didn't know what to say to that. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sky was clear and painfully blue. Roland dug their car out of the snow, and after 2 hours of work, he got the engine started. They were getting ready to leave when Roland pulled something from his pocket, $100 bill. For firewood, he said, holding it out. And food, whatever you need. I stepped back. I can't. You saved my mother-in-law's life, Diane said. She took the bill from Roland and pressed it into my hand, folding my fingers around it. This is nothing compared to that. Please, Mabel added from the car. Let us help you the way you helped us. I looked down at the money in my hand, $100, more than I'd had in months. Thank you, I whispered. Roland shook my hand. Diane hugged me tight. Mabel waved from the car window, her face still pale but alive. I stood in the snow and watched them drive away, the truck disappearing slowly down the white road. When they were gone, I looked down at the $100 bill. Then I looked at the house, the canvas roof, the patched walls, the door that opened when someone knocked. This place had saved me, and now it was saving others. The news traveled faster than I expected. The Richmonds told their story everywhere they went, at church, at the grocery store, to neighbors and friends and anyone who would listen. They talked about the broken house on the prairie, about the 70-year-old woman who'd survived winter alone, about the night she'd saved a life. The story spread through town over the holidays. Someone told a truck driver. The driver repeated it at a diner in Madison, and Tom Shepard happened to be sitting 2 stools down. He came in mid-January. I was outside trying to fix one of the window frames with scraps of wood and nails from Harold's toolbox. My hands were cold, my fingers stiff, but I kept working. I heard a car pull up. Looked up to see a man climbing out, maybe 50, with graying hair and a heavy winter coat. He stood there staring at me like he'd seen a ghost. "Ruth," he said. "Ruth Brennan." I set down the hammer. "Yes." He took a step closer, his face pale. "I'm Tom Shepard. I live near your daughter's house in Madison. I was at your funeral in November." The world went very still. "My funeral?" I said slowly. "Yes." His voice shook. "Vincent said you'd had a stroke, that it was sudden. There was a service at the church and—" He stopped, stared at me. "But you're alive. Obviously." "How—" He shook his head, trying to make sense of it. "Vincent said you died. There was a death certificate. Barbara was devastated. Everyone thought wrong," I said quietly. Tom just stood there stunned. "What happened?" he finally asked. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I told him. Not everything, but enough. I told him about being thrown out, about the $3, about buying this house and surviving the winter, about the letters I'd received, the bank account closed the insurance, paid out the death certificate filed on November 15th. When I finished, Tom's face had gone from pale to red. "He faked your death," he said. "He threw you out and then faked your death to steal your money." "Yes. And Barbara?" I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say about Barbara. Tom looked at the house, then back at me. His jaw was tight. "This needs to be reported," he said. "What he did, it's fraud. It's elder abuse. I know what it is. And then why haven't you—" "Because I've been trying to survive," I said. My voice came out harder than I meant it to. "I've been trying to make it through winter without freezing to death. I didn't have time to fight legal battles." Tom nodded slowly. "I understand, but you have time now, and you have a witness." He pulled a card from his wallet and handed it to me. "Tom Shepard, investigative reporter, Madison Tribune. I'm going to write about this," he said, "with your permission. People need to know what happened to you, what Vincent did." I looked down at the card. "Will it help?" I asked. "It'll make sure he can't hide anymore." Tom left that afternoon, but he didn't stay quiet. The next morning, my name was in every paper in South Dakota. Woman declared dead, found alive in abandoned house. The media storm brought more than attention. It brought the law. Police investigated, found the forged death certificate, found the bribe doctor, found the bank records and insurance claims. Vincent tried to run. They caught him at the Canadian border. Barbara collapsed when police came to her door. The trial was in late February. Vincent sat cold and expressionless. He denied everything, said I'd abandoned them, that he'd acted in good faith. Barbara testified, her voice shaking. I didn't know he forged it. He said she died naturally. I believed him. The judge turned to me. Mrs. Brennan, do you wish to press charges against your daughter? Silence. I looked at Barbara. She stared at the floor, tears streaming. I thought about the little girl who used to hold my hand, the woman who'd been too weak to stand up to her husband. No, I said. But I want Vincent Drummond prosecuted to the fullest extent. Vincent got 10 years. Barbara got 500 hours of community service and full restitution. After sentencing, Barbara found me in the hallway, dropped to her knees. Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't hug her, not yet, but I put my hand on her head. You're still my daughter, but I need time. When I got home, Gladys was there. Harold and Lorraine, Morris, Clifford, all waiting on the porch. They didn't ask questions. They'd lived through it with me. Spring came. I turned 71. The house still wasn't perfect. The roof leaked. The floor creaked. The walls were patched. But it stood. People came sometimes, reporters, strangers, but mostly just folks from Millbrook. Gladys brought fabric. Harold brought tools. Lorraine brought food. They called me Ruth, and that was enough. Years later, someone asked how I survived. I was angry, I said. They tried to erase me, so I had to prove I couldn't be erased. But anger only gets you so far. What kept me alive was waking up every morning and proving something to myself, that I was worth more than $3, worth more than a paper saying I was dead, that I was worth fighting for. The house still stands. If you drive past at night, you'll see a light in the window. I keep it on, always, not for me. For anyone who's been told they don't matter, the erased ones, the ones with nothing but $3 and a choice. The light says, you can survive this. So here's my question. If you were me, 70 thrown out with $3, declared dead, what would you do? Give up or find a broken house and make it yours? Is there a $3 house in your life? Something broken, forgotten, but still worth a chance. If this moved you, subscribe for more stories about human courage. Because survival isn't about what you have. It's about what you refuse to let go of. Looking back, I see clearly now what I couldn't see then. This family drama story taught me that blood doesn't always mean loyalty, and a locked door doesn't mean the end. If you're listening to my grandma's story and thinking it could never happen to you, don't be so sure. Don't wait until you're invisible to prove you matter. Don't let anyone convince you that your worth has an expiration date. God gives us tests we don't ask for. When Vincent threw me out, I asked God why. But I learned that God doesn't save us from the storm. He teaches us to stand in it. Every frozen morning, every board I hammered was proof that God doesn't abandon the forgotten. He lights a path even when the world goes dark. When that family knocked on Christmas Eve, I understood God didn't save me from something. He saved me for something. This family drama story isn't just mine. It's a family drama story whispered in nursing homes everywhere. Every grandma story of an elder pushed aside, every person told they're no longer useful. The lesson: your value isn't measured by what others take. It's measured by what you refuse to let them steal your dignity, your will, your breath. If you find yourself with $3 and a choice, remember, broken things can still stand. Sometimes the smallest light saves the most lives. I've shared my grandma's story with you tonight. If it stirred something in your heart, leave a comment with the number 2. It tells me you made it to the end. Please subscribe for more true-to-life stories like this. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, that they're worth fighting for, share it with them. Sometimes one story changes everything. God bless you and thank you for listening.